Montana Territory. June 1884, the wind carried the scent of fresh earth and wild sage, but all Bethany Willows could smell was death. The small wooden cross sat at the head of the grave, the name etched by her own hand, Samuel Willows, her husband of 8 years. Bethany knelt beside the mound of dirt, her black dress dusted at the knees, her hands trembling as she pressed her palm against the sun-warmed wood. Behind her, 2 small hands grasped the hem of her skirt. "Mama, can we go home now?" her daughter whispered. Bethany turned her head just enough to catch Nova's wide, tear-rimmed eyes. Her boy, Nolan, stood beside his sister, silent, clutching the brim of his father's old hat in both hands. Home. What was left of it? The ranch was gone. The cattle lost to the drought. Samuel's body had given out after months of fever, and the doctor had come too late. Now it was just her, 2 children, and a wagon with 1 lame mule, stranded 10 miles outside of Dry Creek with no kin and no coin. Bethany swallowed hard, brushing her tears away with the back of her glove. She stood, legs unsteady, and gathered Nova close. "We will go," she said softly. "We will find something better." But as they turned to leave the gravesite, a shadow moved through the trees at the edge of the clearing. She stiffened, pulling the children behind her. Her heart pounded in her ears. A tall man on horseback stepped into view, a rifle slung behind his saddle, his black hat pulled low over sun-darkened skin. He dismounted slowly, every movement unhurried as if sensing her fear. "I mean no harm," he said, voice deep, calm. "Just saw the smoke earlier. Thought someone might need help." Bethany's hand hovered near her pocket knife, but she did not draw it. The man took off his hat. "Name's Nolan Ridge. I live a few miles west, near the timberline. Saw the grave." Bethany blinked. "That's my husband," I figured. His gaze flicked to the children. "Yours?" She nodded, his eyes softened. "You are a long way from any town." "We were headed to Dry Creek, but the mule looks near dead," he said gently. Bethany's pride flared, but she said nothing. He crouched by the mule tied to the wagon, eyes scanning the animal's legs. "You will not make it 10 more miles with this one." "I do not have a choice." "You do," he said, standing slowly. "I have a wagon and food, clean water. You and the kids can stay with me a few days. Rest up. I will take you into town after." She hesitated, her fingers tightening on Nova's shoulder. "Why would you help us?" He looked her square in the eye. "Because I have known what it is to bury someone and not know what to do next." Bethany stared at him. His voice carried no pity, just quiet truth. Nolan went on, "You can decide once you have seen the place. Nothing fancy, just land and quiet." She studied the stranger. He stood firm, respectful, not stepping closer, not pressuring her. The children looked up at her, and she saw it then. The weight they carried was too heavy for their small shoulders. "All right," she said, voice rough. "Just a few days." He nodded once. "That is all I am offering." He helped them load the wagon, his movements careful, never touching her unless absolutely needed. When Nova grew tired, he lifted her gently into the back, tucking a blanket around her. He handed Nolan a piece of jerky, and the boy took it without a word. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, the sky orange with sunset. Bethany sat beside Nolan Ridge on the wagon bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She watched him from the corner of her eye, the way he scanned the trail, the way he steered the mules with sure hands. His cabin stood at the edge of a small ridge, overlooking a creek that shimmered in the evening light. A corral of goats bleated softly nearby, and a rough-hewn barn leaned against the wind. He helped them down without fuss, opened the door to the cabin, and stepped back. "Welcome," he said. Inside it was simple. A stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed tucked behind a curtain. Bethany's eyes drifted to the neat stack of firewood, the shelf of canned goods, the soft wool blanket folded on a cot near the window. "Children can sleep here," Nolan said, pointing to the cot. "You can have the bed." She looked at him, startled. "Where will you sleep?" "In the barn. It is warm enough." She wanted to protest, but her daughter yawned behind her, and Nolan was already grabbing a lantern. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Bethany stepped out onto the porch. The moon lit the ridge silver. Nolan leaned against the post, sipping coffee from a tin cup. "You sure this is not too much trouble?" she asked. He looked at her, quiet for a moment. "No trouble at all," she crossed her arms. "You could have left us, most would have." "I am not most." She studied him, the strong line of his jaw, the scar that cut across his left cheek. "You said you buried someone," he nodded once. "My brother, 3 years ago, fever took him. He was all I had." Bethany's throat tightened. "Then you know, I do." They stood in silence for a while. Fireflies blinked in the grass. A coyote howled in the distance. "I do not know what comes next," she said finally. He looked at her, eyes steady. "You do not have to." "Not yet." Something in her chest shifted. That night, she slept better than she had in weeks. By the second day, Nolan had taught Nolan Jr. how to split kindling. Nova followed the goats around, giggling when they nibbled at her braids. Bethany helped hang laundry, her sleeves rolled up, sun warming her skin. Nolan worked quietly beside her, mending a fence, chopping wood, teaching the children how to gather eggs. He never hovered, never pushed, but he was there. Every time Bethany looked up, he was there. That evening, she found herself laughing at something Nolan said over dinner reel. Warm laughter, and he smiled at her like he had not seen anything so fine in a long time. Later, under the stars, she sat beside him again on the porch. This time, she leaned just slightly toward him. "I think I forgot what it feels like to not be alone." "You are not alone now," he said. She looked at him, her heart full and aching. "I do not know what this is." "It does not have to be anything yet," he said, "but it can be something if you want it to." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Maybe." He reached out slowly, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Then he leaned in and kissed her soft, warm, full of promise right there in the moonlight. At the graveside, 2 days later, she returned with the children to say goodbye one last time. She wept, but not from despair. Nolan stood beside her, silent, strong. When she turned to leave, he caught her hand. She looked up at him. He kissed her tears away, slow and sure, then whispered, "Let's start something new." She nodded, and this time she smiled. The soil had hardened over Samuel's grave, sun cracked and quiet. Bethany laid a sprig of prairie clover against the wood before pressing her lips to the namesake cross. The children stood a few paces back, holding hands. Nolan didn't speak. He waited. When she turned toward him, her face held no trace of the fear it once had, only a worn strength, shaped by sorrow but no longer defined by it. They walked together down the slope, the children trailing behind, Nolan carrying the basket with the last of the bread and salted trout. The wind stirred the grasses low and steady, and a hawk circled above the ridge. As they reached the wagon, Bethany glanced over her shoulder once, then climbed up beside Nolan on the ride back. She broke the silence first. "What was your brother's name?" "Isaac," he said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead. "He was younger than me, but steadier. Folks thought he was the older one." "What happened to his land?" "Sold to cover his debts," Nolan said. "He tried to fence in too much of the valley. Thought he could outwork the weather." Bethany nodded. "Samuel planted corn where the soil bucked against it, wouldn't hear otherwise. Sometimes a man loves his land too hard and forgets to listen to it." Bethany looked at him, surprised. "That's a strange kind of wisdom." Nolan shrugged once. "Not mine. A Cheyenne woman told me that years ago. She traded hides for iron pots and always had a way of saying things like they'd been passed down from the river." Back at the cabin, the children ran ahead. Nova darted toward the goats, her shoes scuffing the dirt. Nolan Jr. had grown quiet lately, but today he moved with purpose, carrying water from the creek without being asked. Bethany lingered near the porch, watching Nolan hitch the team. She folded her arms, not out of cold but uncertainty. Nolan, I'm not looking for a man to fix what's broken. He didn't turn. I wouldn't ask you to be anything but what you already are. I don't know who that is anymore. He set the harness down and finally met her eyes. Then let's find out together. Inside, she took to stitching up one of Nova's torn dresses while the stew simmered. Nolan brought in firewood without a word, his boots brushing dust along the floorboards. The children played with the bone dice he had carved, their laughter rising in quick bursts. Later that evening, as the sky bruised purple, Bethany walked into the barn carrying a tin cup of water. She found Nolan seated on a hay bale brushing down one of the mules. The air smelled of straw and wood smoke. I thought you might need this, she said, handing him the cup. He took it, his fingers grazing hers. Thank you. She looked around. This place holds together better than I expected. I built it slow, he said. Didn't have anyone to hurry for. Bethany leaned against the stall door. You're not what I pictured when I thought of the men out here. What did you picture? Rough hands, quicker tempers. He gave a short huff that might have been a laugh. I've had both, and I've had enough of both. She stepped a little closer. You live out here all alone, but you've made space for others. That doesn't come from nowhere. Nolan set the brush down. Isaac believed in people more than I did. After he passed, I started thinking maybe he had the right of it. Maybe you build something worth keeping by letting others inside it. Bethany didn't respond right away. She looked at the rafters, then back at him. It's hard letting people in. I know. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on his arm. But I want to try. He stood, not too fast, as if giving her time to change her mind. When she didn't move, he stepped into her space and laid his palm against her cheek. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. I'll go at your pace, he said. She leaned in. Then stay close. He kissed her again, but it was different this time, not a promise, but a beginning. The air between them softened, and when they pulled apart, Bethany rested her forehead against his chest. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and ash. Inside, the children's voices drifted through the open barn door, high and clear. I don't want to go back to town, Bethany whispered. You don't have to, Nolan said. She looked up at him. Then let's start clearing room. He smiled, slow and true. Room for what? For a life that fits all of us. They walked back to the cabin side by side, the lantern light spilling through the open doorway and the sound of home beginning to take shape inside. By the 7th morning, frost clung to the grass in thin silver threads, though the sun had already begun to warm the ridge. Bethany stepped out of the cabin with her sleeves rolled and her hair tied back in a kerchief, a basket on her hip. She moved without hesitation now, her steps sure on the uneven path to the henhouse. Nolan was already at the fence line, driving new posts into the earth, his shirt dark with sweat across the shoulders. Fence won't hold much longer if the wind comes in from the west, she called, pausing beside the gate. He straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his wrist. I figured that out the hard way last winter, lost 3 goats in one night. Never even found the smallest one. Bethany set the basket down and leaned on the fence rail. I've patched enough chicken wire to know a winter gale doesn't ask permission. Nolan chuckled low in his throat. You always talk like you've got one eye on the sky. I do, she said, her voice even. Not because I want to. Just learn not to trust a clear morning too much. He looked at her then, not with pity, but with the quiet understanding she'd come to recognize in him. You still planning to go into Dry Creek next week? She asked, lifting the basket again. "Only if you're coming with me." Her fingers tightened around the handle. I'd thought about it. There's a woman there runs a mercantile, Sarah Edgecombe. She used to order bolt fabric from my sister in Wichita. Said she'd teach me the books if I ever came west. "You want to keep books?" he asked, a little surprised. "I want something steady, something I don't have to bury." He nodded once, then turned back to the fence, hammer striking wood with a rhythm that matched the wind. Later that day, Bethany took the children down to the creek where the water ran clear and slow. Nova chased minnows through the shallows, her laughter echoing under the cottonwoods. Nolan Jr. sat on a flat stone, carving lines into a piece of soft pine with his pocket knife. Bethany watched them both, her boots half sunk in the mud, the hem of her skirt damp with spray. Nolan joined them after a while, carrying a pair of canteens and a hunk of bread wrapped in cloth. He knelt beside her and offered the bundle. "They're settling in," he said, watching the children. "They've stopped asking when we're leaving," she replied. He didn't respond right away. The creek lapped against the rocks, steady and sure. "You ever think about starting over somewhere farther off?" he asked. She took a bite of the bread and chewed before answering. "Starting over's not about the place. It's about the people standing beside you when the wind shifts." Nolan's fingers brushed hers as he reached for the canteen, and she didn't pull away. That night, after the children had gone quiet in their cot and the fire was nothing but glowing coals, Bethany sat at the table, mending a tear in Nolan's shirt. The fabric was worn soft from years of wear, the stitching uneven from older repairs. He stood beside the stove, setting down 2 tin cups of warm cider steeped with cloves. "Didn't expect anyone to be fixing my clothes," he said. "I didn't ask," she replied, not looking up. He sat across from her, the table between them small but solid. "I used to think I'd be alone for the rest of it. Figured I was too used to my own quiet." Bethany threaded the needle again. "I thought the same, after Samuel passed. There wasn't anything left that felt whole." "You feel whole now?" She looked up at him, the firelight catching the side of her face. "I feel like I'm learning how to be." Nolan reached across the table, not hesitantly but with care. His hand settled over hers. "I meant it when I said we could start something new," he said. "I know," she whispered. He rose from his chair and came around to her side, kneeling beside her. His fingers brushed the fabric from her lap, then found her hand again. "I want to build something that lasts. With you." "With them?" She turned toward him fully. "It won't be easy. I don't want easy, I want real." Bethany leaned down and kissed him, not like before, not tentative, not wondering. This time it was slow, certain, and full of choice. When she pulled back, her forehead rested against his. "You sure you're ready for a woman with 2 children? A sharp tongue and no patience for foolishness," he smiled, eyes closed. "I'd be a fool not to be." Bethany exhaled a laugh she hadn't known was still waiting inside her. She stood, pulling him up with her, and they stood in the middle of that quiet cabin, the scent of cloves still lingering in the air. Outside, the wind had died. Inside, everything had begun. The first snow came soft, just a scattering of white across the ridge, catching in the furrows Nolan had dug that morning along the south fence. Bethany stood at the window, drying her hands on a rag, watching the flakes melt against the sill. The stove ticked behind her, the room warm with the smell of root vegetables and tallow soap. Nova and Nolan Jr. were seated cross-legged on the braided rug, arranging dried corn husks into crude doll figures, their cheeks pink from earlier chores. Nolan pushed open the door with his shoulder, his coat dusted with snow, a coil of rope slung across his back. Bethany turned as he stepped inside, closing the cold out with a firm tug on the latch. "Drift starting to build near the east slope," he said, setting the rope aside. I'll take the axe down in the morning, clear the path before it gets packed. She crossed the room and picked up his gloves from where they'd fallen by the door. You'll freeze if you go out before light. He met her eyes. Won't be the first time. Bethany shook her head and handed him the gloves. You're too stubborn for your own good. He took them, brushing her fingers as he did. You like that about me? She didn't answer, but her lips curved slightly as she turned to stir the pot on the stove. That night, after supper, the children fell asleep early, curled together beneath the quilt Bethany had finished mending last week. Nolan set a log on the fire and drew the curtain closed across the back of the cabin. The heat settled into the walls, and the quiet deepened. Bethany sat at the table, rolling tobacco for his pouch, the lantern casting long shadows against the wood. Nolan poured water into the basin and scrubbed the dirt from his hands, then dried them slowly. You ever think about teaching again? He asked. She paused, her fingers holding the edge of the paper. I taught for 2 winters before I married Samuel. 1-room schoolhouse east of Topeka, mostly farm boys and a few girls whose mothers made them come. He leaned one hip against the sideboard. You were good at it, weren't you? I had more patience then, she said, folding the paper closed. But yes, I loved it. You could do it again. Dry Creek's had a sign posted for months, looking for someone steady. Bethany tied the pouch shut. Would you ride with me there if I went to ask? Nolan nodded. You don't have to ask. She stood, wiping her hands on her apron. I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking if you'll stand beside me. He stepped closer, resting his palm against the edge of the table. I'll stand beside you as long as you let me. Bethany's eyes searched his face. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not afraid of raising these children alone. I've done it, but I don't want to do it alone anymore. You won't, he said quietly. She reached for him, her fingers finding the edge of his sleeve. Then let's write our names into this place, not just pass through it. Nolan took her hand, holding it steady between both of his. The land's already starting to remember you. I want to plant bulbs in the spring, she said, her voice soft. Lilies, maybe some wild iris if I can find the seeds. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. Then we'll dig the beds together. She stepped into his arms, her cheek resting against his shoulder. The fire popped in the hearth, and the wind moved beyond the walls like a hush across the ridge. Nolan wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, and she let herself be held. Later, when she lay beside him in the narrow bed for the first time, she traced the scar along his jaw with her thumb. He kissed her forehead, her temple, the line of her hair, each touch quiet and slow. No words passed between them in the dark, only the sound of breath and heartbeats finding the same rhythm. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the cabin held the warmth of something lasting, not luck, not chance choice. Every inch of it, earned, kept, shared. The thaw came slow that spring, the ground softening in fits beneath the last crusts of snow. Bethany stood at the edge of the garden plot, her hands wrapped around the worn handle of a spade, the hem of her skirt brushing against damp soil. Nolan knelt nearby, turning the earth with broad strokes, sleeves rolled high, collar open to the neck. The smell of wet loam curled upward as each shovelful landed beside the next. Nolan Jr. sat cross-legged under the cottonwood, sketching rows in a cloth-bound ledger Nolan had given him. Nova chased the chickens with a stick, her boots leaving shallow prints in the mud. Bethany placed the spade down and wiped her brow with the back of her hand. I think I'll put the onions here along the north edge. They like the cooler side. Nolan leaned on his shovel. That'll give the beans more sun. And the fence'll keep the goats out if I finish the latch. You mean when I finish it, she said, arching an eyebrow. He tapped the handle against his palm. You planning to wrestle cedar slats with that arm of yours? She stepped closer and took the shovel from him without blinking. "You forget I grew up on a wheat farm." He smiled, but this time it was softer than teasing. "No. I remember." That night, Bethany sat with a needle and thread beneath the lantern, not mending but sewing new. The fabric was pale green calico, a bolt Sarah Edgecombe had offered her on credit after their visit to Dry Creek. She ran her fingers over the pattern, careful and slow. At the table, Nolan polished the barrel of his rifle, the children already asleep in the loft above. "I've been thinking," he said without looking up, "about the schoolhouse." Bethany paused. "What about it?" "I heard from the blacksmith's wife her cousin's the circuit rider. Said the town council's planning to raise the funds for a full-year teacher, not just winter months." She tied off a stitch. "That'd be steady income, and I'd still be home before supper most days." He set the rifle aside and folded the cloth over it. "If you want it, I'll take on the extra fence work. We can manage." Bethany met his eyes. "We already are," he nodded. "Then maybe it's time we stop managing and start living." She set the sewing aside. "Nolan, there's something I've been meaning to ask." He leaned forward, arms resting on the table. "Ask." She reached beneath the bench and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside lay a ring, simple gold, dulled at the edges from years of wear. "It was my mother's. I've kept it packed away since Kansas." Nolan took it in his hand, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. "She'd want you to wear it." Bethany shook her head. "She'd want me to pass it forward, to someone steady. Someone who keeps his word and shows up even when the road's washed out and the roof's leaking." He looked at her, quiet settling between them. "You sure?" "I've been sure since the second day here," she said. "I just needed time to say it out loud." He stood slowly, came around the table and knelt beside her. "Then let me ask you proper." She laughed, one hand rising to her mouth. "You don't have to, I want to," he said. "Bethany Willows, will you marry me and build a life with me that starts with seedlings and ends with grandchildren under this roof?" Her answer came without pause. "Yes. Yes, I will." He slid the ring on her finger and it fit like it had waited all this time. They married in early June beneath the cottonwood, with Sarah Edgecombe reading from her tattered Bible and the blacksmith's wife providing a pie for the celebration. Nolan Jr. stood beside Nolan, his shoulders square and proud, while Nova tucked prairie asters into her mother's hair. The goats bleated through the vows and no one minded. At sunset, Bethany and Nolan walked the edge of the ridge, the sky laid out in gold and fire. She held his hand, her thumb tracing the lines of his palm. "Do you ever miss what came before?" she asked. He looked out at the valley. "I carry it with me, but I don't live in it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think I finally believe in tomorrow." He kissed her temple, his hand steady on the small of her back. "Then let's wake up to it together." Years passed, and the schoolhouse stood firm, its windows bright with children's laughter, and Bethany behind the desk with chalk-stained fingers and a proud smile. Nolan built out the barn, added 2 more goats and a pair of draft horses. Nolan Jr. took to drawing maps of the land, and folks started calling him the cartographer's boy. Nova grew wild and clever, her hands always full of feathers or seed pods, her voice a song in the wind. Each season brought its own rhythm: snow in the rafters, rain on the sill, sun on the porch rail. But always, there was warmth in the walls, and the bed held 2 bodies entwined in sleep and peace. On their 10th anniversary, Bethany brought out a second ring, one she'd had made in Dry Creek, silver-banded and strong. She slipped it onto Nolan's finger as they stood beneath the same cottonwood, its branches thicker now, its roots deeper. "This is for what we built," she said. He kissed her like the first time, slow, sure, and full of promise. And nothing, not drought nor frost nor time, ever loosened the grip. They kept on each other, hand in hand, heart to heart, through every morning that followed.